I've really missed everybody, and I first just want to start with a big thank you. It's been hard to be away from B'nai Shern for a whole month.
You didn't have to go.
Thank you. Thank you. But it's been super helpful for the two of us to just be able to learn how to be parents and have that time to.
So you're an expert. You're an expert now.
That's what today's about, actually. It's a perfect segue.
I know an expert now in motorboat.
Yeah, hardly. So I want to start with that. We always like to start with an opening question as we're settling in. I know we're getting a later start, but so we won't go in too much into it. But I want to know the classic Shakespearean question: what's in a name? So if you have any significance behind your name, if maybe you imparted a name to somebody that had special significance, just want to share before we dive into why we chose the name we chose for our daughter. What's in a name? Anybody in the room or Zoom want to share? Some personal reflections.
What we do is when we have named somebody, we assign actually some characteristics, which sometimes we're aware of, and sometimes we're not.
Right.
And it's not just a name you have to be careful of. As we know, we said, watch the initials.
Don't you say? Right. So it's a quality, sometimes aspirational qualities and traits. Let's go, Bob, and then on Zoom, go ahead.
It's interesting with what was just said. My Hebrew name is Eliezer. I'm named after my father's father. And as near as we know, he was a very miserable man.
So God help you, right? Eliezer, yeah. Good. Okay, Nelson. And then Tybal. Go ahead, Nelson.
Okay, I was named for my mother's father, Nathan, who oddly enough, terrible thing, he died in shul.
Oh, wow.
But that wasn't the point. The point was my father said to my mother that Nathan is an immigrant's name. We're not going to use it. And he convinced her that we should name me after Nelson Eddy, who was a famous movie star when I was born. But later in life, after I had a chance to ask him about it, I found out that he was really an Anglophile. And so I think I was secretly named after Lord Nelson.
Wonderful. Let's go Tybal, and then in the room, and I want to welcome Sarah. She's coming straight from a meeting. Thank you for joining. Great to see you. Okay, now Tybal.
So the short version, I basically have 3 or 4 names. I use all of them in different venues, settings. But I was named after a great-grandmother who did not have a Hebrew name. So my religious name, what I think of as my real name, is Tybal, which is Yiddish for dove. Then I come from a traditional family, so that was translated to, in English, transliterated, it's Jonina, the feminine of Jonah. Lifelong nickname, my parents called me Nina. So I have an informal secular name, a formal secular name, and a religious name. The full version being Tybal Bas Rachel Leah V'Shlomo Yehoshua, and my family, we do mother first. But what I was about to say is, often in my life, even as a kid, where I would make an observation or notice something and predict it, and my parents would say something, I would say, if you didn't want me to be that kind of a prophet, you should not have named me Tybal. You know,
Good.
That's what I think about names in my family.
I love it. You're just living up to your name. They can't blame you. Yes, over here, this corner. Let's go. Marcia, right?
I've learned from coming from, I'm in a big family. My husband is in a big family, that babies are absolutely individual. Jewish people spend years picking the name, who's they named after, what's the Hebrew name, and then they get a nickname from their cousin, and it's all over. So I just think Jewish naming is a very interesting pastime.
Yeah, it makes me think of, you can't always control how people refer to you or the name that sort of becomes what's ascribed to you. I'm thinking of like the Baal Shem Tov, master of a good name. What does it mean to sort of come into a name that's not necessarily a name that you were given at birth? Grace, and then we're going to move around the room.
I believe that we carry on souls, those that are departed before. I'm named after my grandma Goldie, who went to the gas chamber along with my daddy's sister and younger brother. my mother and
Wow.
younger brother and sister. My Hebrew name is Zahava, which is gold, but I don't use it. When I went for my ketubah, the woman at Jacob, the Jewish bookstore said, "What's your Hebrew name?" I said, Goldie. She looks at me, she said, "That is not Hebrew." Yeah, because I'm Goldie, I will always be Goldie. It's funny that I'm a Leo, my name is Goldie Karen, which means gold rays.
Right.
Gold rays, son, Leo.
But yeah, so carrying on the soul, and right, there's a difference between Ashkenazic and Sephardi tradition. Can you name after somebody who is alive or only departed? Is it superstitious to name after somebody who's still alive? Are you putting a bad omen on them? Okay, there are a few hands here.
That's a funny story. So I was born in Israel in a Moshava Kinneret. And my parents were new immigrants from
The
Poland. My
Kinneret?
mom's sister was named Tzina and she died in the Holocaust. So my parents said, her name was Zina. They wanted to call me Zina. Well, what did they know? So their Israeli neighbor said, you changed the Yud to a Vav. In Hebrew, it's Zona, which is a prostitute.
Right.
You do not call her. Why won't you call her Tziona? So they said, okay, and they called me Tziona. When I grew up, Tziona was a very Yemenite thing. So in the 50s, 60s, there were no Ashkenazis that were born. So when we went anywhere, they said Tziona Dresner was my name. And I raised my hand. They kept looking for something. But that's the history of my name. Yeah.
I love it. How about a couple more, then we're gonna dive into the text. Let's.
It's true. My husband used to say that in a divorce and a get, they put all the names that you are known as.
Yeah, that's
They
right.
do not have a family name, we don't have we don't use your last name, but what we do is call you, if you're called Shlomi or you're called Fatso, all these names here in the get.
Right.
We know exactly who it is.
Yeah, and it's a way to be legally precise, right? Whether you're known by this or this or this or this, it's like being thorough and comprehensive. Nina?
Oh,
Sorry, I got you with the button.
munching on my. Well, I used to spend hours picking names for my pets. Because, I thought, I want to pick a name that I'll feel comfortable calling him. Well, when it came time to pick a name for our first child, it was the most daunting and awe-inspiring responsibility ever had.
I'll be saddled with it
And,
forever.
Larry probably, I don't know, it really was. I never named a human being ever in my life. And I just thought, they will be carrying this name to their whole life. What will be the reaction? How will they spell it? What, everything about it, just everything. And so for me, that has always stuck with me, that Larry and I together named two human beings. And it's, for me, it's probably one of the most joyful responsibilities that we ever had.
It is. It's an amazing responsibility. And it's interesting going back to the first commandment, really, one of the first given to Adam and Eve, which is to name the animals, that there is a sense of responsibility that comes with naming a creature, that if you name it, there is this bond that says, okay, and also a form of understanding. Can you really understand something if you're not able to have a name for it? That with naming comes an attempt to understand. So we named our daughter Noah, and you might think, oh, Noah's Ark, wonderful, the animals, maybe an animal lover, maybe righteous in her generation, but that's not the Noah we named her after. We named her Noah, who is one of the daughters of Tzlofchad, which is the first text we're going to dive into. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, the daughters of Z, Bible says, Z for short. And I want to quickly jump in. Exactly. Let's dive into that text. But first, can anybody explain who are the daughters of Tzlofchad? What is the episode that involves them?
Inheritance.
Go ahead, shoot.
Yeah,
Yes.
That Tzlofchad died and he had 5, right? The 5 daughters, and they weren't going to get any land. You have to remember how important land was. This is in Eretz Yisrael in Israel long ago. This is a Tanakh story. And, so they went to Moshe and they said, this is not right. We are our father's heir, but we're not going to inherit anything. And then Moshe went to God, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yes.
He goes to Hashem and he says, you know, what should we do? And it's decreed that they should inherit the same way that sons would have.
Right,
And so we think of it as a feminist story
right.
that the daughters of Slovchad, he did have a hard name, but I'm used to that, talking about that. That's the story. Is there one more piece that I left out?
No, that's beautiful. Yeah, great. Of course. So one thing just to keep in mind is that that is how the land of Israel was divided by tribe, right? The 12 tribes. And those are, in order to stay within the tribe, if you were to marry outside the tribe, and back then in the patriarchal, society, then you would be losing your tribal inheritance if a woman married outside of her tribe. So then what the question is, what happens to that land? We don't want to mix and match the land that was assigned by tribe. So that poses a real problem. If you're marrying out, then you could lose. So it went through the son to make sure that the land stayed in the holding of the tribe that it's in. So we're not mixing and matching the land inheritance. That makes sense, right? Any questions about that? So the questions that the daughter of Slofchad bring is, well, what do we do? Our father didn't have any sons. Is it fair? Is it just that his name should be erased because we marry outside the tribe? He's going to lose that land. The tribal inheritance is not going to stay within the family. And what's more, they say he was a righteous man. He was not part of the Korach rebellion. He was a good guy. He was on your team ever since the beginning. He doesn't deserve to lose his inheritance.
Alan, you know
Go
that
ahead,
whole
yeah.
thing?
Oh, I don't think that's part of this. So who wants to read the first text, even though we discussed it?
I called.
This is from Numbers.
So you needed to call earlier. It's a thing.
Bible, you're not muted. Just a heads up. I'm gonna mute you. Go ahead. Yeah. Any takers to read the first text from Numbers?
The daughters of Zelophehad of Manassite family, son of Hefer, son of Gilad, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, son of Joseph, came forward. The names of the daughters were Machlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirth. Is it Tirtzah?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And God, when you're reading in English, you don't always get the name right.
It's okay.
God said to Moshe, the plea of Zelophehad's daughters is just.
A couple interesting things I want to point out here. Number one is, this is why we named her Noah, because we were not going to name her Machlah, Hoglah, Milcah. Second thing.
Preparing for 5 girls?
Yeah. Just like this one of the 5. Yes. Ruth. Go ahead.
Is it 6?
Is there any? It's a great question. I'm not familiar. I'm sure there must be, but I don't have it, so I'm not sure. I'd have to look it up. But I'm curious if we want to research this and come back, because I'm not sure. I sort of glossed over it. Yes. Right. So what is that about? I wonder, maybe there's a story behind it, and I'm sure the commentaries come up with some. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the homework. This is the class where you assign homework to me. Good. I want to know. But a couple other things. Number one is check out the emphasis on the lineage, right? It seems significant that daughters of Slofchad of Manasseh, and then they give the whole lineage of Slofchad that brings you all the way to Joseph. So I think, again, it's that idea of what I think Grace said about inheriting the soul of your ancestor, that there's this idea that, hey, are we really going to betray the merit of Joseph here by not taking care of this line? This is a righteous line. And by denying them land, this is an offense to not just this individual, but the whole family that they embody, that the individuals embody.
When we talk about this being a tribal thing also, don't the men of the tribe come back a little later on in the story and say, this is fine, but the land has to stay in the tribe, so they have to marry within the tribe?
Yes. They do. So it comes with a qualification later that, okay, they can marry whoever they want within their tribe. So we still have to address this problem of keeping the land in the tribe. But what is so powerful about this text for me is that they come forward with a problem that they're deriving from God's law to Moses. And Moses has the humility to say, I don't know the answer to that. Let me ask God.
Yeah.
And God comes back and says, not who are they to question my perfect law? Or who are you to disturb me? Figure this out yourself. God says, they're right. They speak justly. They speak right. So it almost makes you think that God is inviting and wanting this kind of engagement and intimate participation with God's law and from everybody, right? God could have also said, who are these women? Who are in that society? Who are they to come to you with a matter of law? No, God is inviting and embracing and almost waiting for this kind of pushback and participation. Go ahead.
Okay, I mean, I hate to bring this up, but if they did it then, okay, the daughters of Salah, then why can't the whole idea of the women who don't want to be chained, the agunot?
Good.
I mean, it's also a very similar, I mean, you can make the analogy.
It is. Hold on to that because our final text is coming from a contemporary Israeli woman who writes Midrashim and does a lot of representing of women who are agunah. The problem of agunah means an anchored woman. An agunah is somebody for whom in traditional Jewish law, only the husband can initiate a religious divorce, a get. Only he can deliver the get. And that comes from the verse that says, when he delivers a get. So the rabbis say, so it can only be the husband who initiates the divorce. And that creates a real problem where if a husband refuses to give a get, then a woman is stuck. If a husband goes out to war and is missing and presumed dead, but you can't prove that he's dead, then the woman cannot remarry because that would be adultery unless you can convert. So there's this real problem of the agunah, the trapped or anchored woman. And so that's our last text we're going to sort of address. There's a midrash from somebody who addresses that in real time. Go ahead.
I looked it up online. It does say that mala means sickness, and it says it's a weak or sick person. I wonder if they didn't name her until after they saw that she was very sickly when she.
Interesting. So a weak or sickly person. But that's still sort of this disturbing thing. Like, why name somebody after? So it's a good question. Thank you for looking up. Still curious, Ron.
I'm going somewhere a little bit different.
Okay.
It just struck me that this is one of the cases where there were 5 girls. Didn't matter that they were girls, and this, for what I'm going to say, is that they got along with each other. They approached together.
Good. And we're actually going to get to that too. So hold on to that. Yes, that's going to be relevant. Okay, so I'd like to move on. Let's go to Sifrei
Wait,
Bamidbar.
Rabbi?
Oh, Taiva, I
Rabbi?
said I'd get you. Please, yeah. You speak just.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I happen to, because of an aunt who was named Tirza, who had no children. So special to me, I have a soft spot for Tirza. So was there a reason why, I mean, the Mala, I get whatever, but is there a reason why Noah spoke to you more than Tirza?
That's a great question. Honestly, just personal preference. There's nothing wrong. It's a beautiful name. I kind of like superficially see Surus in there, even though it's not really there. You'd have to swap some letters around. No, but it's a beautiful name. And there's so no, I don't mean to not give that enough deference. So thank you for elevating that one.
When you pick the name, did you come right here, or did you find the name and then you're fine?
Well, it's a very popular Israeli name.
Of course.
Yeah. So we just liked it. Oh yeah, your granddad.
You liked it. You
liked the name,
or you found the reason.
That's a great question. Chicken or the egg? I'll leave that ambiguous. I think we liked the name, but we also, our minds did go here, and we liked it for the reasons that we'll talk about today. N-O-A. So let's go to Sifrei Bamidbar.
Hey,
Yeah.
Marty and Debbie.
Okay. Grace is going to read for us. This is coming from the Midrash on the book of Numbers, where it compiled mostly around 200 CE in Israel and Babylon. It's mostly legal, but there's some Agadah, some narrative Midrash as well. Go ahead and read for us if you don't mind.
When the daughters of Zelophehad heard that the land was to be apportioned to the tribes and not to female, they gathered together to take counsel, saying, not as the mercies of flesh and blood are the mercies of the Lord. The mercies of flesh and blood greater for males than ain't that the truth? Not so the mercies of he who spoke and brought the world into being. His mercies are for males and females equally. His mercies are for all, as it is written, the Lord is good to all, and his mercies are upon all of his creations.
Tov Adonai l'chol rachamav al kol ma'asav, on all of God's creations. And which psalm, which prayer does that come from?
I know it, but I don't remember.
I'll sing it and it'll unlock it. Tov Adonai l'chol rachamav al kol ma'asav. Yeah, Ashrei, right from Ashrei. So this Midrash is elevating the feminist quality of the Daughters of Zelophehad episode, saying that there is a big difference between legal systems that human beings construct versus legal systems that God ultimately wants, or maybe how human beings interpret divinity through the lens and biases of their own limited perspective and time and historical context, right? That ultimately we live in a society where we do see, and Grace said, ain't that the truth, right? That that oftentimes it feels like things can be unequal and unfair and weighted towards male advantage. I'm not saying that's true across the board for everything, but I do think it's true. I'm just saying, I'm trying to be a little, wait, one second. So I'm not saying for each and every, but by and large, I think we can agree that that is very much true. And this Midrash is saying, but that's not God. God doesn't, where does that come from? That bias can't be coming from God. God, who, and the proof text is, God has mercy equally on all of God's creatures, quoting Ashrei. Go ahead.
And that's why I want to say that he didn't. And the reason I'm saying that is, I don't think he ever would have allowed sacrifice if he did.
Say more. Did what?
If all his creations he had mercy on, he never.
Oh, okay, so
he
good.
would never have had sacrifice.
Good. So Ron is including animal. When it says God has mercy on all God's creatures, ma'asav, that's not just human creatures, that's animal creatures too. And if God truly had mercy on all of God's creatures, then why would God demand sacrifices? And for that, I can only turn to like one of my favorite Maimonides teachings, which is about animal sacrifice, that it was never what God actually wanted. It was this interstitial step. Yeah, God allowed it, right? So I don't mean to be overly apologetic for it.
We go through 1/5 of the Torah is explaining all the sacrifices.
Right, no, exactly. But I think that initially, if you look at Gan Eden.
According to his rules.
Right. But if you look at Gan Eden, at the Garden of Eden, originally we were not meant to eat animals. We were supposed to eat the fruits of the tree, right? And
which also were his creations.
That's true. So we should look at all that. I love your non-speciesist approach to the world. It's beautiful. But I will say, I do think that God makes concessions for human beings. And I think that conveys a divine disappointment, but immutability.
For men over women too, then. You can't have it both ways.
No. I think your point about animals is really important, but I wanna complete the thought about Maimonides, saying that it was this initial step away from child sacrifice, which was the prevailing practice at the time, but that people were not ready to go straight from 0 to 60, from child sacrifice. I need to sacrifice the most precious thing to me to God, and that's my own child, to show that I don't withhold anything from God. From that idea, we couldn't go straight to, actually, God just wants to sacrifice the words of our lips, that's what God truly wants is prayer. That step was too big a conceptual leap to make. And so we needed to do something with our tribal instinct to slaughter something to please God. And so God gives us this system of animal sacrifice that was never meant to be the ultimate destination. And the way Maimonides proves that is by saying, if you look, when God frees the children of Israel from Egypt, they don't go the short way, they go the long way, right? They don't go the way of the land of the Philistines because there's war there. And God says, lest they see war and get afraid and want to turn back. So God takes us the long way. And Maimonides says that that's a metaphor for sometimes we can't just go the short way from A to Z immediately. People need a longer way so they're not overwhelmed and turn back. And so God was conceding to a human impulse and need to ultimately get us to a more just system, which doesn't invite killing anything, right? It's prayer, that's what God truly wants.
Nice wiggle. Nice wiggle, Rabbi.
No, but that's to say that we have a system that is not necessarily given to us in its final perfect form, but needs our engagement. And we've had a couple Midrashim, and then I'm gonna get to David, that has addressed that point. Remember when we talked about God gives the flax and the wheat to two different people, and the flax, the wheat. I think there's a third thing, right? To two different people, one person returns those objects in pristine condition and says, I kept this perfectly for you, to the king. It's a metaphor, right? To the king saying, I guarded these for you. The second person comes back with bread, what they made the wheat into bread, and a tablecloth that they wove for the flax, right? And God says, to the first person, why did you give it to me exactly as I gave it to you? Look at what this other person, they made beautiful creations out of it. And similarly, that's sort of this rabbinic approach to divine law, which is that God doesn't give it to us in its finished form and want us to just preserve and return it, but God wants us to spin it into these beautiful creations. And I think that that's what the daughters of Zelophehad are doing, saying that God has given us this divine, beautiful raw material, but I'm seeing that there is an opportunity here to create something with our participation. And God says they speak just. It seems God wanted that kind of participation and co-creation and engagement. David, go ahead.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is, I've heard this idea from Maimonides before, but I haven't actually read it. So it's interesting that you put in the idea of what we might have called Moloch worship. Although I suppose we're not supposed to have that on our lips, except when we're reading it. But anyway, I'm getting aside the point. The point is, the way I've heard it before is that animal sacrifice was the common form of worship in the ancient world, which it most certainly was. And the archaeological evidence doesn't support that there was massive child sacrifice. It occurred in some places and not in others, but animal sacrifice was widely done.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just throwing that in as a commentary on your commentary, if you will.
Right.
Which brings me to my first point I was going to make, which is, of course, the Midrash is a commentary.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that we see the rabbis doing all the time, and apparently nobody necessarily brought this up at the time, but if you put the words of Ashrei into the mouths of the daughters of Zelophehad, you have an anachronism because it wasn't written until much later.
Yeah. You put it in.
It doesn't mean that you couldn't do it anyway,
Mm-hmm.
but it kind of emphasizes that it's a commentary by doing that.
Right.
Unless, of course, you make the argument that if people weren't as literate at one particular time, and we're used to hearing things, then hearing both of those things and not worrying about what time they might have been written down wouldn't have bothered them maybe as much as it bothers those of us who are reading rather than necessarily hearing.
Right. And that is something that as Midrashists, we just sort of have to get more comfortable with, because the rabbis say, and commentators in Rashi, that there is no beginning and no end in Torah, that you don't be bound by chronology. Which is frustrating, especially you gave for somebody who appreciates history and a chronology and a timeline. But in this sort of realm of Midrashic interpretation, they don't seem fettered by what comes first or what comes second.
And I'm not even really arguing with that. I'm just suggesting that it actually emphasizes the reality that this is a made-up story to teach a point.
Sure.
As opposed to literally what the daughters of Zelophehad may or may not have done.
Totally fair. Totally fair. But I even say, right, that that our patriarchs and matriarchs, that they knew Torah, but obviously Torah hadn't been given yet. Right? And Abraham is serving meat and milk, but the rabbis say, well, but he served the milk first and then the meat, right? So it's ascribing anachrolas.
Or he was serving it to angels who don't eat anyway,
right,
and it didn't matter.
Isn't Shabbat of all the holidays considered the most holy of all?
Yes, Shabbat is, because if you look at the Ten Commandments, it doesn't say, remember Yom Kippur, which we often
No,
think of as the,
Shabbat.
but it says keep Shabbat. So
It's the queen, it's the female, the woman that brings in the Sabbath.
yeah, no,
But yeah, we're like second-class citizens. We're supposed to have the babies and keep the home kosher and whatever. But we still, like in this house, I called us the hypocritical denomination of Orthodoxy because my daddy went to Green Road Shul every, he helped build it. The original Green Road Shul, but yet he would drive and we ate shrimp.
right.
So, we never got, my sister and I never got bat mitzvah because
Right,
it
right, right.
wasn't, women weren't supposed to.
Practice, right, practicing Orthodox
Right,
even. No, exactly, right, but what's wonderful is Judaism has all of these very ahead of its time thoughts and for instance, Shekhinah, the divine aspect of God and Kabbalistic thought, God's imminent presence, right? So it's there, which is amazing for us. It's not like this is only, you only find the feminist ingredients if you're looking for them from like modern eyes. In its time, it really was ahead of the game in so many beautiful ways. Go ahead.
That's rattling around in my head for some time. I'm remembering a movie called Divorce Italian Style. And I don't know if anybody else is as old as I am, remember this. Where divorce was forbidden by the Catholic Church. And the way to really get a divorce was the ultimate. You kill the other party and you don't have to worry about
Sure.
I just wonder, you know, given the situation where a woman is chained, waiting for a man to utter the words that would free her. And has there been any reference to taking this individual who is so recalcitrant and eliminating him from the equation?
So let me tell you something, and I'm going to watch a movie, Jackie the Mobster, any day. So whenever we want to make that movie,
Brooklyn, these things.
yeah, but a couple things. So the answer is actually yes. If you study Masechet Gitin, right, which is the tractate on divorce in the Talmud, the rabbis talk about how to handle a recalcitrant husband. They don't go so far as to say you whack him, right? Like you won't find that, but they do say you compel him. And it does feel very mobster, where basically like they show up at your door with crowbars, kind of a thing, right? Like which
Baseball bats.
baseball bat, right?
Fine. We just had one a few years ago. Marsha, you might remember, because it was in Marsha Beck. Because when we were, because the Cleveland Jewish News was highlighting it, there was someone in the Orthodox community wouldn't give a divorce, so they went ahead, they put posters up, they wouldn't hire him, I mean.
Apply pressure.
They have learned, the women have learned that's the only way to apply pressure is by using social media.
Yeah, so there are ways. So it's one of these things where there is this tremendous respect for the tradition as handed down. Right, they can't just go ahead and say like, we can't, right, they can't say if they believe, right, that this is how God said it and wants it to remain, right, and the conservative movement is bound by the same, except we have other ways, right, we put clauses in the ketubah that can dissolve the marriage retroactively if the husband will one day refuse to give a get, so that's how the conservative movement handles it. But in the Orthodox movement, where they don't have those clauses in the ketubah, there are other ways to pressure a man into doing this. So you're still striving for justice, but while honoring the tradition as handed down, right? Okay, I want us to move on to our next text, and then we're gonna wrap up with the final one at the end. Who wants to read? This is Rabbi Shraga Silverstein. He is a contemporary rabbi, no longer alive, Zichrono Livracha, but he was an author and translator in Jerusalem, and he gives a little bit of commentary on what we just read. This Midrash from Bamidbar. Anybody want to read? Go ahead, please. Yeah.
For the Lord said of them, they will surely die in the desert, and there was left not a man of them, followed by, and there drew near the daughters of Zelophehad. What is the connection? Scripture comes to teach us that the strength of the women in that generation was greater than that of the men. The men saying, let us make a leader and return to Egypt. And the women saying, give us a holding.
Great. So I generally, like my approach, I really believe in feminism and I aspire to be the best feminist I can be. Yeah, but even before. But my approach is generally, I don't try to disparage men in order to elevate women, right? I truly like to see men and women as, equal in opportunity and law and all of that. Though every individual is different. But this commentary is taking that approach of sort of disparaging men in order to elevate the women. But here's the proof text that they bring, right? Which is simply, if you read the book of Numbers, you have two verses that follow each other, right? The end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The end of one says, for the Lord had said of them, this was the generation that was taken out of Egypt. They will surely die in the desert, and there was left not a man of them except for the two, Caleb and Joshua, right? The generation that left Egypt, they didn't have the faith to be ready to take the land of Israel, right? They said there are giants there. We were like grasshoppers. They were too scared, and they wouldn't do it. And that was such the slave mentality that God ultimately says, this generation is not ready to enter the land. Their children will, right? So that generation is going to die in the desert. And then it's followed immediately by, and there drew near the daughters of Zelophehad. So the question that he's asking is, what is the connection between that verse being followed immediately by this next verse? And the answer is, Scripture comes to teach us, by connecting these two verses, that the strength of the women in that generation was greater than that of the men. The men saying, let us make a leader and return to Egypt, right? So pointing to another verse in Numbers where the men say, again, like, we're not ready for Israel. We can't do this. Let's go back. It says that the men said that. It doesn't say the women said that. It says that the women here, the daughters of Zelophehad, said, give us a piece of the land in Israel. Why should we lose our inheritance in Israel? So he's comparing the men who said, we're not ready for Israel. We don't want Israel. Let's just go back to where it was familiar. And we knew we had our leeks and our cucumbers and we knew that what it was, at least. Let's go back to the women who had at least a greater imagination, a greater propensity for imagining what life could be, not just what life was, but also this cleaving to the land of Israel, saying, why would you take this away from us? We want this. We need this. We deserve this. Go ahead, Jerry.
On the other hand, the women participated with the men in the golden calf.
Right.
So right away, there is a problem because they're not perfect either.
And that's sort of why I did that preface I did, because what I don't like is you'll often hear, why are women exempt from time-bound mitzvot? The answer Chabad may give you, and I'm not disparaging Chabad. I have a lot of respect for Chabad. But the answer I get a lot in more Orthodox, not just Chabad, in Orthodox spaces is, well, women are inherently more holy than men, so they don't need as many mitzvot. That's why men have more mitzvot, because the male soul is more degraded or animalistic, so we need more to be elevated. And I don't like that. And you're welcome to. I'm not saying what you can and can't. I don't like that because I think it justifies inequality, saying, well, okay, well, that's why men get more, because we need more.
Well,
so you should be satisfied with not
when
needing
you say justify, we should at least honestly go further to a class I once took with an Orthodox rabbi who you made that very point.
Right.
And then went on to make the point that the pedestal on which women were standing, or to which they were chained, depending on your point of view, meant that they were responsible for cooking, cleaning,
right,
in some cases even doing the work so that the men could study, because the men had to elevate themselves and the women were already elevated. So I had said two things to that, not to directly to him, the second one, but the first one is, it doesn't sound to me like the drudgery you're describing is exactly elevation.
Right.
On the one.
Right.
And the second point, which I didn't make to him because that would have been A, disrespectful, and B, useless, is if that's the case, then why shouldn't the women be the rabbis, and why shouldn't we be studying with them to elevate ourselves if they're so elevated?
Amen. Women. Yeah.
And I'll just make another plug for Rabbi Barmash's responsa, where although the movement certainly hasn't gone to this point for all sorts of reasons that I am perfectly willing to listen to and accept, essentially says that the whole argument of time-bound mitzvah is Narishkeit anyway, on the one hand, and she does a beautiful job of demolishing it.
So you define Narishkeit?
And second,
I just indicate that.
stupidity, idiocy, whatever you like. Foolishness, thank you, foolishness. And then goes on to say that that women are in a modern society, the only real difference between men and women at this time was, if you will, empowerment. And with both men and women empowered, men and women should be equally obligated.
Beautiful, yeah. Go ahead, yeah. And then Nelson, because I know you.
Which many women say, oh my God, we would be obligated, to which many men reply, and thank God, God is merciful and loving and doesn't strike us down with lightning bolts when we don't do what we're supposed to do.
Exactly.
Midrash, excuse me, what exactly is Midrash?
Oh, good, sure. So Midrash is a body of rabbinic interpretation of Torah that falls under two categories. One, halacha, where you're deriving law through sort of interpretive approach to the text. The other is agadah, which is narrative, and sort of deriving stories and insights through interpretive reading of the text. This class is mostly that latter category, doing the narrative.
Okay.
But here, this is actually more halakhic because we're talking about legal. Yeah, exactly. Go ahead, Nelson.
It strikes me, and I'm sure others have gotten here, that traditional societies that will always elevate women ideally, but in fact, elevate men. So when you see a society that praises women in many different ways, you know that they put them down in reality.
Right. Right. It's this front. Right.
Well,
but
a few minutes ago, you were praising Judaism for elevating women in a variety of ways. I think that's just sheer sign that something was wrong.
Sure. No, I that's fair. But I will say, I think, and it's why I'm bringing texts like these. There's always the like apologetic approach to say like, look, there's an example I can show you here, and therefore the whole, it's okay that there's inequalities elsewhere. But no, my approach to the tradition, which is embodied in our text through this midrash of the daughters of Zelophehad, is that God gives us this divine, indescribable gift of Torah, and yet God wants our active participation in continuing to understand, interpret, unfold it, and make it, and reveal a more equal and just society through our engagement with it. So, and that's coming from Torah. That's not just like my thoughts on coming from nowhere, right? That's what this midrash is showing, that the daughters of Zelophehad come forward. This is no trite, elevating women, but it's really just a front for keeping women unequal.
No, but there's another point here as well. That it's a proof text that the idea that everything was given on Sinai is false. God says, I didn't give this one on Sinai, and I was wrong. I made a mistake. I left something out. And I think that obligates us to provide what God left out. I mean, this is really, to me, the proof text of the conservative movement.
I think you're right about that this is a pretty conservative movement way of engaging with halakha and tradition. But I wouldn't say it's black and white, where if God is acknowledging that there is human work to be done in this partnership with text, that therefore what was given at Sinai is false or wrong.
No, he says that here. He says to Moses, I didn't put this in. He doesn't put it that way, but he says, they're right. Something is missing.
Right. So you could say, how could God be admitting that Torah therefore isn't perfect? To which my rebuttal is, no, this is God demonstrating for us what it means to have given us a perfect gift. It would have been imperfect if it came wrapped and ready and all, plug and play.
It's incomplete.
I think that's actually an imperfection, right? I think the perfection is God saying, this is not complete until we partner on it. Right. And that's not to say that we're equal partners. I don't believe we're equal partners with the divine. But I think that is what's so radical and beautiful about Judaism, that it changes your conception of what it means to be a perfect document, right? That is perfect. Do not touch. Here is the flax and the wheat that you gave me in the form in which you gave it to me. Or is God disappointed in that and said, where was your imagination? I wanted you to do better than this. Don't just give it to me as received. I want you to interact with this. I want your role, your active role. I want you to be my partner. That to me is more perfect than the first case. I want us to have enough time for this final text because it's really rich, and then I'll give Bob and Sheila last thoughts. So let's go. Who wants to read? This is the modern Midrash written by Rivka Lubitsch. She lives in Israel, and she helps represent women who are agunot, stuck in this traps arrangement. Okay, who wants to? It's in 3 different parts. Go ahead. We'll do 3 different readers. Nina.
Why were they referred to first as the daughters of Zelophehad and only afterwards by their own names? Because of Zel and Pachad, shadow and fear, that was in them at first. But at first they dwelled in their father's shadow and feared to raise their heads. Once they drew near to one another, they were empowered and known by their own names, as is written. And the daughters of Zelophehad drew near, and these are his daughters' names.
Great, so classic midrashic wordplay. That what is so interesting? Zelophehad is such an interesting name. What is behind that name? And they say, well, there are 2 Hebrew words: Sel, which is shadow, and Pachad, which is fear. And so they're saying that the daughters who are referred to without names at first, they're just the daughters of Zelophehad, really means that they are the children of fear and shadow, that they are in their father's shadow and not really individualized yet. But this is a moment where, what was the catalyst? Coming together. And that was Ron's point, where it took this group of women coming together to sort of empower one another, to come out of that shadow, to overcome that fear and confront Moses and God with their plight. Okay, and that's how they get then we get their names. They're not just the daughters of Zelophehad, these are women with names.
And their mothers are never mentioned.
And their mothers are never mentioned. Yeah, that is an interesting point. That is an interesting point. But I'm also thinking of how you earn your name. I think that was a point you made as well, right? So this is exactly that, saying that they now earn their names. Before they were the daughters of Zelophehad, in this act, they now have earned their names. Question before we go to 2?
Yeah, you know the commandment to take care of the widows and the orphans.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking it's interesting that the widow comes first in that commandment. And it's one of the few that, again, like with the daughters, specifically for women.
Mm-hmm.
But in a case when what does that actually mean, to look after the widows and orphans? But if the woman had no children, or in this case, of course, we don't know if she's alive or not, in this case, would being a widow, would she inherit? Does she get any land or holding or anything?
It's a good question. You're saying if...
or is that why they have to take care of the widow? Because she gets nothing.
Right. Well, the widow is definitely a vulnerable class in that society. And so...
by the oldest son or one of the
It's a
brothers?
good question. I need to look it up. But point being that certainly what's being elevated here is look after those who are most vulnerable in your society. And I think the orphan and the widow encapsulate particularly vulnerable groups in ancient society. If a man who has the land dies and they don't have children, you're saying, would it go to the wife?
Maybe one example.
I would presume yes, for sure. But I'm not certain of that, but I'm fairly certain.
As long as she marries.
Tybal, and then I want to make sure we get through this final text.
Just fast, what she gets if he dies is her ksuba. What was determined in the ksuba, she does not get the land.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Number 1. Number 2, I get to use one of my favorite words I learned in Talmud class. The situation is different if she came into the marriage with usufruct, which is property that was hers that then becomes her husband's during the pendency of the marriage, but he's supposed to use it to support her. If he dies, the usufruct reverts, the ownership reverts back to hers. Ownership of his stuff doesn't go to her. Absent sons, it goes to his male relatives, and she gets paid her ksuba, and she's supposed to support herself out of that.
But she also gets his brother if he's unmarried. Or if.
Yeah, the
If
letter
she doesn't
A-
have any kids.
If they don't have kids, that's Yibum, right? If they don't have kids. So
Doesn't
thank
have
you,
sons.
Tybal. That's exactly, yes, yes. So the food, shelter, and clothing is what's guaranteed in the ketubah, the legal document of marriage. So that's what she would get, not the land unless it's usufruct, which just means it was her land to begin with that the husband got through the marriage, but then it goes back to her. Otherwise, if she didn't have that, then it would go to the male relatives at the time. Thank you for that clarification. That definitely brought me back to rabbinical school, and I appreciate that you had it right on the tip of your tongue is amazing. So let's go number 2. So now going back to the verse, rightly can do Zelophehad's daughter speak. Who wants to read? Hey, go ahead, please, Lois, thanks.
Note asked God, if Zelophehad's daughters spoke the truth, why didn't you write that in your Torah in the first place? For after all, you are truth and your Torah is truth and your word endures forever.
Good, so I think this was Nelson's concern, right? Hey, God, if you say that they're right, why didn't you just include it in the first place? So go ahead.
God answered, truth will grow from the ground.
Boom. And there's the answer that I tried to articulate. But by the way, we had a midrash on this. If you remember, when God is going to create the world, 2 groups of angels debate each other. One group says, create the world, create the world. The other says, don't create the world. It's going to be filled with violence and anger, right? Truth says, do not create the world because human beings are going to fill it with lies, right? But Chesed says, create the world because people are going to fill it with loving kindness. And if you look at Chad and Ellen and others on our Sunshine Committee, Nedra, a big benefactor of it, you would say, yes, people will fill it with chesed, with loving kindness, right? So it's this great debate that happens. And ultimately, what does God do? If you remember the Midrash that we studied a while back, how does God respond to the 2 groups?
He throws
truth to the ground.
I had to stop and think which one.
God casts truth to the ground and then says this verse from Psalms that truth will grow from the ground, which you can interpret a number of ways. The way that I interpret it in this context, and I think this Midrash is interpreting in this context, is God wants human beings to have a role in determining truth, an active role. From the ground means from earth.
Right.
It is not just giving from on high, but that it will sprout from the ground, that human beings will. So that is why it wasn't given in that quote unquote full form. Okay, let's keep going. Tanot asked, Lois?
Asked, but is it not written God's Torah is whole?
Good rebuttal. But what do you mean it's not whole? It says in Psalms, God's Torah is whole.
God answered her, I already wrote in my Torah, be wholehearted with God, your Lord. And what's more, I wrote, walk before me and be wholehearted.
Good. So yeah, Torah is whole, but it's your wholeness that makes Torah whole, right? You are that conduit that makes Torah whole. Yeah, I did say Torah is whole, but it's your Torah that I need, right? You are the missing piece that makes Torah whole.
This walk is this Genesis 17:1. Is that Noah?
Let me see.
Noah's story or are we somewhere else?
That is God telling Avraham.
That's Abraham.
V'hiyeh tamim before the circumcision. Right before the circumcision to Abraham, to Abram at the time, to Avram. Good. Okay, let's keep going. There is truth that descends.
There is truth that descends from on high, and there is truth that grows from below. Blessed is the generation in which truth from above meets truth from below. And this is what scripture means when it says, truth will grow from the ground and justice look down from heaven.
So there's that meeting point that this episode of the Daughters of Zelophehad are treading upon, where truth from the ground, which is the daughter saying, hey, I think there's something missing here, meets justice smiling from above, God saying, they speak Ken, they speak correctly. It's that meeting point. Okay, let's wrap up with 3. I'll do it if it's okay. The cynics of the time said, Zelophehad's daughters are hypocrites. They said they're doing this for their own power, their own prosperity, to make themselves men's equals when it comes to inheritance. They aren't doing it for the sake of heaven, right? This is self-motivated. They just want land. It's not actually about justice. It's about they wanted land. It's financial. That is why the Torah says ken, rightly as an honest, kanut, and rightly as in correct, nachon, right? Ken, you find it in both the word honest, kanut, and in the word nachon, right? So it's saying, no, don't waste time thinking that they had ulterior motives, right? That's why Torah uses that word ken. They act for their own, here's what's great. The truth is, they do act for their own power. They do act for their own prosperity. They do act to make themselves men equals when it comes to inheritance, and they act for the sake of heaven, right? It is by advocating for their interests that they are actually fulfilling the will of heaven.
They have rights.
So next week we'll learn where Hadar comes from.
Yeah, now it's just gonna be all the names. So yes, when we decided what to name our daughter, we wanted to bestow upon her the merit of Slofchad's daughters, specifically Noah, though Tybal has enlightened me that there are other beautiful names there too that we could have chosen. But we like that idea of divine partnership and creating a more just world, of being human partners with the divine and understanding, ascertaining, interpreting, and applying God's will. And that's a process that we pass down from generation to generation.
She also in memory of a relative.
Sorry?
She also named in memory of a relative.
She is.
The two grandfathers.
Yeah, so
You merged it.
we did.
Very clever.
Thank you. So my grandpa, who you all
Howard.
comforted me in his recent loss, Howard, so there's an H-O-W, and her middle name is Harlow.
Yes.
Alex's grandfather died a couple years ago, Harvey, and this is the first child born since his death. So we sort of merged them into Harlow as an English middle name that we just like the sound of, but in Hebrew it's Hadar. So it's Noah Hadar, which we like the Sukkot, and just the beautiful tree references there. Yeah.
Usually.
Yeah.
So we need pictures.
Okay, picture. Yeah, it's a lot of, at this point, I do want to dismiss everyone. Don't feel trapped here, but it's no one holds classes in the dust.
For the pictures, which I know everyone wants to stay and see. First, it's great to have Rabbi Jacobs back with us. Thank you, and we're excited to have you back. Now you can go each week. I also want to remind everyone that this evening